Hey, my name's Steve McHugh, and I haven't done one of these for a while actually. I know I said I was going to be, doing them regularly, and then the world burned out. So yeah, I kind of have been busy working and trying not to think about the fact that we were on lockdown and in the middle of a pandemic. So I hope everybody out there is okay, and um, that you're doing as well as you possibly can. Um, so the point of this particular video is that I thought I would do a reading because I did one for the Super Fantasy Club, and it seemed to go down well. So I thought I'd do one for myself. And then I kind of thought, okay, so what am I going to read? So I figured that I would read my work in progress, which I know most even authors don't like to do. They don't like to read their work in progress, and I figured it might be fun as opposed to reading something Harlequin based. This is not Harlequin based. This is a whole new world, whole new characters, whole new everything. It does not yet have a publisher. It is still a rough story, so it hasn't been edited beyond me going through and changing a few things around to make it make sense. So you need to bear those things in mind before before you listen to me read. The book is called Silent Ruin. This is going to be the first chapter. The book is actually about someone called Lucas Raven, but he's not in the first chapter. The first chapter is about something else entirely, and it takes place in a city I made up called Hamble in New York State. Because I quite like making up cities because it means I don't have to worry too much about, actual geography. Which is why most of these places, a lot of the places I made up in Hello. Anyway, that's a different thing altogether. So anyway, I'm going to read this. I don't know if I'm going to read the whole thing, but the actual my desktop's behind this, and so I'm reading off of that. So when I look up to the corner, I'm not trying to. I know that's a bit weird, me looking up there whilst the camera's here, but that's just how it is. So I'm probably not going to read the whole thing because it's 3,000 words, the first chapter, but I might do. See how I feel. Right. So people often say how picturesque freshly fallen snow looks. Actually, before I start, eye safety. People often say how picturesque freshly fallen snow looks, when in reality it's only sanitising the world, nature's equivalent of sweeping the crumbs under the carpet. But few talk about how creepy and otherworldly it looks at night, when it's lit by streetlight. The unearthly glow that wouldn't look out of place in a horror film. Charles Lane smiled to himself with that. He looked around his office to find a pen so he could write it down to tell his wife later. He'd only forget otherwise, and the idea would bounce back into his head 2 weeks from now, when the snow was likely to have melted along with his opportunity to say something interesting. He found a pencil and matching yellow post-it note and scribbled down his thoughts before studying it for a moment. He looked up at the white-faced clock on the wall in his office. It was 3:30 a.m. Far past when Charles liked to be asleep, tucked up in bed without a care in the world. But that was when his wife was at home. Charles logged out of the computer on his desk and waited for the fan to stop sounding like it was going to take off as it shut down. Far too old, he said to himself, giving the tower an affectionate pat. But you still work. Lane's Music was a small shop in Hamble, New York, but had its fair share of loyal customers, and his grandson, Reese, had encouraged him to create an online shop, which had been a big hit. Now Lane's Music was shipping all over the state, and even across the country on a few occasions. Charles was proud of what he created, what his grandson had helped him create, a successful business that moved with the times. He used the arms of his chair to push himself into a standing position. He was only 56, but he'd broken his knee when he was younger and stupider, and when it got cold it caused him no end of aggravation. Charles looked round the office. He wished his wife Elizabeth was here, but she was in Rochester with her sister Anne. Good night, sweetheart, Charles said, looking out of the window up at the cloud-covered sky. He said the same thing every night when she was away. He knew that Elizabeth couldn't hear him, but he knew that she was aware he said it, and that was enough. Charles had trouble sleeping, and while Elizabeth had asked him if he'd want to join her, he'd explained that her sister needed her, and she should go, as he had too much work to do. Elizabeth was also fully aware that Charles wasn't Anne's biggest fan. She was on her fourth or fifth husband. Charles couldn't quite remember, as she'd married one of them twice. And she'd been caught sleeping with her gym instructor or tennis instructor or someone young enough to be her son. Her husband had left her, and Anne had hit the call sister for help button on her phone. She made out that she was the victim, only ever contacting Elizabeth when she needed something, and Elizabeth, because she was kind and thoughtful, had gone to comfort her. Charles wished that Anne didn't self-destruct so often, and that she was able to keep her shit together for longer than a few months, but every family has its issues. Apparently in Elizabeth's case, all of the issues were given to one person. Charles sighed and ran his hand over his bald head before yawning. He needed to go home and sleep. He needed a shave. He needed food that wasn't reheated in a microwave because he didn't want to make something just for himself. The front door to the shop was locked, the shutters were down, and while he considered sleeping on the couch in his office, he knew that if he did, he'd only wake up sore and unhappy. Time to head back to his house on the other side of town. Go home, Charlie, he said to himself, looking out of the window again at the fresh snow that covered the parking lot behind his shop. His car, a 1971 bright red and black Plymouth Barracuda, that his two sons and daughter had purchased him for his 50th birthday. It had taken him 5 years to rebuild it and get it running properly, and Elizabeth was not a fan, so he only got to use it when alone. It was, in his eyes, the single perk to his wife going to visit family without him. Charles pulled down the blinds over the window, walked over to the door that led out to the set of steel steps in the parking lot, and grabbed his warm, dark grey coat from the peg on the wall beside the door. He picked up his thick green hat and matching scarf, both of which he'd promised Elizabeth he'd wear at all times, put on a pair of black leather gloves, and opened the door. Once outside, and after gasping at the realisation that the wind chill was much worse than he'd remember coming in, he turned around and locked the door, pulling down the shutter with a crash that appeared to echo all around him. Charles took a second to look around. There weren't any residences around this part of town, and he was pretty sure the shutter would have woken the dead, so he was grateful for not incurring someone's wrath. He locked the shutter in place and set off down the steps, making sure to keep himself steady so he didn't end up in his ass and have to explain to his wife why he couldn't walk properly. It had started to snow again. Big chunks of flakes falling from the sky, like God himself was having a serious dandruff problem. Damn it! Charlie thought to himself, remembering he'd wished to write that one down too. Elizabeth would have liked that one. Lake Ontario was only a few hundred metres in front of Charlie, and the air coming off it was cold enough that even with the added layers of clothing, Charles could feel it in his bones. Staying this late had been a mistake. He reached his car and fished out the keys, fumbling with them as he tried to put them in the keyhole of the car door. Charles almost had them in when a gust of wind made him gasp, and he dropped them on the ground next to his foot. God damn, Charles said, and wished he hadn't bothered opening his mouth to let the cold air inside. He quickly retrieved the keys from the ground and unlocked the car. As he opened the door, he thought he'd heard something in the distance. The parking lot wasn't overly large, with enough space for only a dozen cars, most of which belonged to the owners of the 24 shops on the street with his own. But across the road there were several large warehouses with a 20-foot high chain link fence all around the loading areas at the rear. Charles squinted his eyes as he looked over at the warehouses, but there was nothing there, just his imagination, or the wind, or something he had no interest in identifying. Still, that tiny piece of brain that had once warned ancient creatures well before they became human that there was danger, was warning him that something was wrong. Charles looked around the parking lot, seeing nothing, and turned back to his car just as he saw a young man scramble over the fence and drop down into the warehouse cargo area. "Hey kid," Charles shouted as he walked round his car toward the road. The kid in question was in his early 20s, although the darkness and distance made it hard to tell for sure. He ran back to the fence. "You need to run," he said. fear evident in his voice. "Run where?" Charles asked. "What's going on?" "Run," the kid said, turning away and sprinting off. Charles knew he'd said the word. He felt the word mouth make the movements. His brain told him he'd spoken, but no sound had left his mouth. He tried again. Run where? And once again, all that left his mouth was silence. Charles looked around, slightly panicked, as he tried to figure out what was going on. He ran back to his car, his bad knee protesting with every step of the short distance. He flung open the car door, but a hand rested upon it, stopping it from opening further. "Hello," the voice said. It was soothing, male, but it created a fear inside Charles that he hadn't felt in a long time. Not since the accident that broke his knee. Charles turned around slowly, trying to squeeze into the too small gap between the door and the driver's seat. The man was 6.5 feet tall, putting him over a head taller than Charles. He wore a long black wool coat that was fastened up tight, the collar pulled up around his neck. He wore no hat or scarf, and Charles had the urge to ask him if he felt the cold at all. The man had on a pair of black leather gloves, much like Charles's own, but that was as much as Charles could have said about how the man looked. He wore a mask that reminded Charles of a hockey mask, but it was painted black with a red slash that went from the forehead down to the chin, crossing over one shadow-covered eye. "Hello?" Charles tried to call out, but found no sound would leave his mouth again. "Apologies," the man said, his accent placing him from somewhere in New York, but Charles couldn't have identified it if he'd been offered $1,000, mostly because he was absolutely terrified. The man stepped aside, keeping hold of the door, revealing someone behind him. Charles couldn't tell if it was male or female. All he could see was the black trousers, black leather coat, and a mask that was white, with red handprints over the eye holes, as if a child had made it. The other person wore a collar around the neck with a chain that reached down to manacles on their wrists. A separate chain sat on the floor out at the feet of the man holding the car door. "Better?" the man asked with a wave of his hand. "What's going on?" Charles asked. "Well," the man said as the sounds of metal being torn filled the air, and it took every ounce of effort from Charles not to turn and look at the fence where the kid had climbed over moments earlier. The man holding the door released his grip and clicked his fingers twice in front of Charles's face. Although they made no sound due to the gloves, they had the desired effect. "Well," the man said again, "you are in the unfortunate situation of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, Mr. Lane," he said, almost without thinking. "Mr. Lane," the man said soothingly. "I believe that you should probably forget everything you saw here tonight." There was a shout from behind him, followed by an horrific scream that split through the night. The man in the mask sighed. He turned to the chained one behind him. "Go." The chained individual ran off with jerky movements, the chains jangling in the night. "So, Mr. Lane," the masked man said, "what should I do with you?" Charles swallowed. He wished he'd gone to Rochester with his wife. He wished he'd stayed home. Right now, he'd have settled for moving in with his sister-in-law and never complaining about her ever again. "Let me go home?" Charles asked. The man chuckled. "I would like to do that," he said, leaning in closer to Charles, so that the older man could feel the masked man's breath on his face. "I would really like to do that. What assurances can you give me that you won't go talking about what you've seen here?" Charles shook his head. "I don't want no part of whatever you're doing, or whatever you are. I just want to go home." The masked man removed a large knife from a sheath on his hip and tapped it rhythmically against the car door. "You seem like a sincere man, Mr. Lane," he said. "An honest man, with an honest job and an honest life." "I would like to believe you, Mr. Lane, but—" "No," Charles said, interrupting the stranger. "No buts. I never saw a goddamn thing. I just want to go home. Please." The masked man appeared to study Charles for several seconds. "Okay," he said. "I think you've made a good argument. I believe that you will go home and that you'll forget all of this happened. Because, Mr. Lane, I would hate to have to come to your home and pay you a visit there. To pay your family a visit, your friends, your neighbours. I would hate to have to involve you in something you so desperately don't want to be involved in. I would hate it. Do you understand me?" Charles nodded enthusiastically. The masked man stepped back with a flourish. On your way then, my good Mr. Lane. May our paths never cross again. Charles didn't need to be asked twice and drove out of the parking lot like a proverbial bat out of hell. He didn't stop for anything until he hit a red light. Charles sat there, panting and trying to calm himself, not even realising that the light had turned green. He inwardly cursed himself for the fear he felt, and he drove off, not stopping again until he arrived home. It was a simple, two-bedroom detached home, in a street of almost identical-looking houses. There was a meticulously maintained lawn at the front, next to the drive that Charles pulled into. The lights inside the house were set on a timer, and Charles sat in his car and watched them flick from room to room. He wasn't entirely sure what he was expecting to see, but the pattern of lights going on and off soothed him, making him realise that he was safe now. He removed his cell phone from his pocket and considered dialing the police, but he needed to calm down first and have a drink before doing so. He needed to be sure that he was safe, that his family was safe. He got out of the car and walked up the steps to the front door, unlocking it and stepping inside, punching in the 4-digit code into the alarm system a few feet along the hallway wall. Charles closed the door and took a breath, in and out, focusing on nothing but his breathing. Then he poured himself a large measure of vodka and knocked it back in one gulp before pouring a second. He switched on every light he could find as he walked through the house, checking every room, checking the closets, under the bed, anywhere that might be a hiding place. He knew it was silly. He'd driven away at speed and there was no way that anyone could have arrived before him, but still, he needed to check. When Charles was satisfied, he sat down in the armchair and sighed. He stared at his cell phone for several seconds, wondering whether or not to call the police. Something about what had happened tonight had scared him in a deep part of his psyche, and he couldn't bring himself to do anything. He was going to get out of the house, head to Rochester, and call them there. He looked back at his phone. He was no coward. He called the Hamble Police Department and spoke to someone there about what had happened. When it was over, Charles walked into his bedroom and packed a bag for staying away for a few days. He couldn't sleep in his own house. Maybe a hotel would be better, more secure, just for a few days. He left his bedroom and, standing at one end of the long hallway, stared at his front door. It was ajar. He'd been certain that he'd closed it when he'd entered his home, and yet now it was open. Fear exploded inside of him, and Charles froze. He wasn't sure what to do next. After what felt like an eternity, he picked up his bag and walked towards the door without looking anywhere else. He left the house, closing the door behind him with a click, and then cursed himself for bothering. He almost ran to the car, popping the trunk, throwing the bag inside. He practically slammed the trunk shut and raced around to the driver's side, opening the door only to see a familiar gloved hand clamp down on the door. Charles turned to see the masked man again. He went to scream for help, but no sound came out. "Now that's not very nice," the masked man said. "You said I could go," Charles mouthed, not caring that the words didn't leave his throat. "I changed my mind," the man said, and plunged a dagger up into Charles's throat. The masked man held Charles for several seconds. To anyone watching, it might look as though he were giving commiserations. He removed Charles's cell phone from his pocket and found that it wasn't password protected. The last call was 911. The man stepped aside, removing the blade, as Charles slumped to the ground, blood pouring from the wound. He couldn't speak, he couldn't do anything except know he was going to die. Except now he wasn't going to see his wife and children again. The masked man crouched down beside Charles. "I won't kill your neighbours and family," he said. "If you hadn't been here when I'd arrived, I would have." Charles blinked. "Goodbye, Charles," the masked man said. "It was a pleasure to meet you." And those were the last words that Charles Lane, married father of 3, ever heard. Okay, well, there you go. That is the first chapter of my work in progress. Again, I don't know if or when that will be published, if ever, but it's what I'm working on, so we'll see what happens. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it, and I might do another one of these, but actually read one of the previous books. And if you do want me to do that, then please do leave a comment and let me know what book you would like me to read from. I will not do the voices of every character, because half of them would sound terrible and or offensive. So just because people ask me to do the voices for characters, and that's not happening. So yes, but I'm happy to come and do some more. So take care of yourselves, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.